May 1944, North Atlantic. A German U-boat crew never expected an American admiral to treat them like this. They waited on deck for the bullets. 58 men from the crippled U-505. They expected only to die. Instead, Rear Admiral Daniel Gallery offered them soap. He offered them bandages and dignity. But this kindness came with a hidden rule, one that broke the Geneva Convention. A rule that made them vanish from all official records. When the man who saves your life also erases your existence, is it still mercy? Tell us where you're listening from and the exact time there. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If mercy and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. The sea on May 15, 1944, was the color of steel, and the North Atlantic wind cut like a blade. For the 58 German survivors clinging to the deck of the U-boat U-505, the water was a near-freezing grave waiting to claim them. Their submarine had been forced to the surface by relentless American depth charges, its steel hull groaning and broken. Now, American destroyers circled them south of Newfoundland, their guns aimed and ready. Every German sailor, from the youngest boy to the seasoned officer, expected a bullet or the unforgiving sea. They had been taught that this was how it ended. Instead, from the bridge of the aircraft carrier, USS Guadalcanal, Rear Admiral Daniel V. Gallery gave a different kind of order. He told his men to bring the Germans aboard. He ordered them to provide food, bandages, and soap. As the U-boat's commander, Captain Lieutenant Harold Lang, limped up the boarding ladder, his right arm shattered and useless, he looked into the eyes of his American captors. He was prepared for contempt, for the cold fury of an enemy who had lost ships and friends to men just like him. Instead, a young American sailor handed him a clean, dry towel. Another offered a steaming mug of hot coffee. Lang would later recall the thought that struck him in that moment of profound disbelief. Everything he had been told about how the Americans treated their prisoners could not be true. The contradiction was immediate and stunning. In the middle of a brutal naval war, there were no reprisals. There was only hot water, dry clothes, and a quiet, unexpected kindness. Before the capture, life aboard U-505 had been a slow descent into misery. Lang's crew had spent 70 days submerged, much of it hunting convoys off the coast of West Africa. Rations were short, the air was thick with the suffocating smell of diesel fumes, and morale was dangerously low. They had lost contact with their command, unaware that Allied codebreakers were tracking their every move. Encounters with depth charges were a routine part of their existence, a terrifying but familiar drumbeat of war. But this time was different. At 11:09 the morning, a pattern of charges from the destroyer escort USS Chatelaine found its mark. The explosions were violent, close, and crippling. The U-boat's rudder was destroyed, leaving them helpless beneath the waves. The final order came through the intercom: surface and scuttle. They were to abandon their vessel and surrender themselves to the enemy, or to the ocean. In World War II, submarine warfare offered no quarter. It was a notoriously brutal theatre of combat, where the usual rules of engagement rarely applied. By 1944, the German Kriegsmarine had suffered devastating losses. 75% of all U-boat crews would never return home. It was widely understood that Allied policy did not require the rescue of enemy submariners during an active engagement. Many simply drowned as their vessels sank into the silent depths. Protections under the Geneva Convention technically applied to prisoners of war, but few sailors on either side expected them to be honored in the chaos of a naval battle. Admiral Gallery's force, a hunter-killer group designated TG-22.3, had explicit orders to sink enemy submarines, not rescue their crews. But Gallery was a different kind of commander. He had studied U-boats for years. He understood their mechanics, their tactics, and their weaknesses, and he wanted to capture one alive. It was a gamble that defied standard naval doctrine. Rather than delivering a final, killing blow to the crippled U-505, Gallery ordered a boarding party to seize the submarine. The mission fell to a young officer, Lieutenant Albert David, from the USS Pillsbury. He led a small team of men who swam through the frigid Atlantic waters and climbed aboard the abandoned, sinking U-boat. They moved through the flooded compartments, fully aware that the German crew may have left behind booby traps set to detonate. With methodical calm, David and his men cut wires, closed valves, and plugged leaks, saving the submarine from sinking just moments before it would have been lost forever. For this incredible act of bravery, Albert David would later receive the Medal of Honor, the only one awarded for capturing an enemy vessel at sea during the entire war. The capture of U-505 was a historic achievement. It was the first enemy warship captured on the high seas by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. The intelligence haul from the submarine was a treasure trove that would save countless Allied lives. On board, the boarding party found 2 Enigma cipher machines, current codebooks, charts, and operational orders. But the triumph created a serious and immediate problem. 58 German prisoners, alive and now in American custody. There was no plan for them. As the captured sailors were brought aboard the USS Guadalcanal, they were cleaned, fed, and given medical attention. The American sailors, many of whom were young men who had lost friends to German torpedoes, were stunned by Gallery's orders. He told them to treat the prisoners as they themselves would want to be treated if they were captured. One American sailor later wrote about his confusion. He hated what the U-boat stood for, but when he saw a Navy medic gently bandaging a German boy's foot, he saw not a monster, but just a kid, caught in the same war as him. The Americans shared what they had: soap, fresh socks, bandages, and even playing cards. Admiral Gallery later explained his philosophy to the press. He said that mercy was not a weakness, it was a form of discipline. While the American sailors wrestled with this new, strange duty of caring for their enemies, Rear Admiral Gallery faced a dilemma of his own. The capture of U-505 was a monumental intelligence victory, but it also presented a quiet and urgent legal problem. The rules of war, specifically the Geneva Convention, were clear. Any nation that captured enemy combatants was required to notify the International Red Cross within 7 days. This notification would allow the prisoners' families to know they were alive, not killed in action. It was a rule designed to preserve a measure of humanity amidst the chaos of global conflict. But if Gallery followed that rule, if the Red Cross informed the German government that the crew of U-505 were prisoners of war, Berlin would immediately know that their submarine and its precious codebooks had not been sunk. They would change their codes, their ciphers, and their naval communication systems overnight. The priceless intelligence advantage the Allies had just gained would vanish in an instant. The lives of thousands of Allied sailors, soldiers, and airmen depended on keeping the capture an absolute secret. Gallery was caught between his duty to the law and his duty to win the war. He chose secrecy. The 58 German prisoners were not officially prisoners of war. They became ghosts. Under top-secret orders, they were completely hidden from the outside world. Their names were removed from official manifests. They were kept in strict isolation aboard the USS Guadalcanal during the long voyage back across the Atlantic. They were not allowed to mingle with other captured personnel or speak to anyone outside a small, designated group of American guards. The initial kindness they had received, the soap, the coffee, the warm clothes, now began to feel unsettling. It was a comfortable cage, but a cage nonetheless. Days turned into weeks, and the German sailors, including their commander Harold Lang, realized no one was coming to register their names. The Red Cross never appeared. Their questions about their status, about their rights, about their future, were met with polite silence. The mercy that had so shocked them now felt like a precursor to something unknown, and their relief curdled into a quiet, gnawing fear. They were eventually transported under a shroud of secrecy to the United States, ending up at a remote facility named Camp Ruston in Louisiana. There, they were held for 267 days, a little less than 9 months, in a special, isolated compound, far away from all other German prisoners of war held in the country. The secrecy was a heavy burden, a psychological strain that wore them down day by day. One sailor tried to keep track of time by carving a makeshift calendar into the wooden frame of his bed. Another lost count of the days entirely, drifting in a sea of uncertainty. Langer later wrote about this period of erasure. "We were not POWs," he recalled. "We were ghosts, no letters, no visits. The war might be over, and we would not know. They were fed, they were clothed, and they were not abused. But they had ceased to exist. Their families in Germany would have received notice that U-505 was missing, presumed lost with all hands. Their mothers, wives, and children would be mourning them as dead. This knowledge was a unique and silent form of torture. The initial act of mercy had become a source of profound confusion. Kindness now felt like an elaborate trap. They began to fear the worst, that they were being kept alive, only to be executed once their intelligence value was exhausted, or worse, that they would simply be forgotten, erased from history, never to return home, their fates a permanent mystery. The discipline and humanity shown by Admiral Gallery's men at sea had led them not to a prisoner of war camp, but to a void. Inside the isolated compound at Camp Ruston, life settled into a strange and quiet routine. The German crewmen of U-505 were guarded, but they were not abused. They were kept entirely separate from the thousands of other German prisoners of war held elsewhere in America, their existence a closely guarded secret. During the long, humid Louisiana days, the guards and the prisoners developed a quiet, unspoken understanding. Some of the American GIs, young men from farms and cities across the country, would play chess with the German sailors in the quiet evening hours. There was no shared language of politics or war, only the silent language of a game. But these small moments of humanity could not erase the crushing weight of their isolation. The secrecy was a constant, invisible pressure. Any letters the men tried to write home were intercepted and never sent. The Red Cross, their only link to the outside world and the rules of war, never arrived. As the months dragged on, the men began to wonder if they would ever see their homes again, if their families would ever learn the truth of their survival. Rear Admiral Gallery, aware of their situation, remained firm in his principles. He refused to allow his prisoners to be treated like animals, despite the strategic necessity of their concealment. He told his officers, "They are men. They wore the uniform. They did their duty. Now so will we." For Gallery, honor was not something that could be set aside for convenience, even when the laws of war were being bent. The decision to hide the U-505 crew was a calculated risk, a choice that placed life-saving intelligence above international law. By keeping the capture a secret, the United States knowingly and deliberately broke the Geneva Convention. It was a morally grey area, legally risky, and it represented a profound gamble. Gallery would later defend his actions and the orders he followed, arguing that the intelligence gained from the U-505's codebooks saved thousands of Allied lives. By continuing to read German naval communications, the Allies could reroute convoys away from U-boat wolfpacks and more effectively hunt the hunters. The information, he argued, shortened the war in the Atlantic and prevented immeasurable loss. But this justification, however powerful, never faced a formal legal review. There was no trial, no public debate. The decision was made in the shadows, a quiet footnote in the history of the war, known only to a handful of men in high command. The cost of secrecy was borne silently by the 58 men in Camp Ruston, who paid for the preservation of Allied lives with nearly a year of their own. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the secret was still kept. The German prisoners remained in their isolated camp, unaware that their country had surrendered. It was not until 1946, long after the fighting had stopped, that they were quietly released. They were told to speak of their capture and their time in America to no one. They were sent back to a Germany that was in ruins, a nation shattered and divided. Kapitän-Leutnant Harold Lang returned to his home city of Hamburg, a landscape of rubble and ghosts. He was missing a hand from the attack, a permanent physical reminder of the day his life had changed forever. He never joined the new German Navy, choosing a quiet life away from the sea. But in the pages of his private diary, he wrote about the Americans who had captured him. He wrote, "They treated us not as enemies, but as men." And then he added a small, simple detail that he had carried with him through all the months of uncertainty. "I do not forget the coffee, or the soap." Admiral Gallery retired from the Navy in 1960, having spent the remainder of his career advocating for policies that strengthened protections for prisoners of war, his actions in 1944 having shaped his understanding of duty and honor. He had answered the question of what to do with an enemy who is no longer dangerous. You show him a dignity that he, and the world, will not forget. The years that followed the war were a quiet tide, pulling the world away from the shores of memory. But some things remained anchored in the minds of the men who had lived them. In 1954, a full decade after their capture in the cold North Atlantic, several of the former crewmen of U-505 did something remarkable. They were civilians now, scattered across a rebuilding Germany, working as mechanics, clerks, and factory hands. The war was a lifetime ago. Yet, they came together to compose a letter. It was addressed to one Daniel V. Gallery, the American admiral who had ordered their capture and then commanded their humane treatment. This was not a letter of grievance or a request for aid. It was a letter of thanks. After 10 years of silence, after being erased and then returned to the world, they felt a need to bear witness to the one thing that had mattered most on that terrifying day: the unexpected mercy of their enemy. They wanted him to know that they remembered. In their careful, translated words, they recounted the story that had been seared into their minds. One former sailor wrote of the propaganda they had been shown, the films and speeches that promised them a brutal death at the hands of the Allies. "We were taught Americans would shoot us in the water," he wrote. "They were told they would be left to drown. That capture was a fate worse than a quick death. They had surfaced from the depths, expecting the final, violent judgment of war. Instead," the man recalled, "American hands had reached down to lift them out of the sea. They had been dried, warmed, and given fresh, clean socks for their cold feet." He remembered the simple, profound shock of it. This act of decency, so small and yet so monumental, had shattered the lies they had been told. It was a truth more powerful than any weapon. The soap, the coffee, the bandages, these were not just supplies. They were a message. They were proof that even in the heart of a conflict that demanded hatred, the humanity of individual men could refuse to be extinguished. The submarine itself, the steel shell that had been their home and nearly their tomb, also embarked on an unlikely journey. After the war, the U-505 was a captured relic, destined for the scrapyard. Most captured vessels were studied and then dismantled, their secrets stripped and their hulls melted down for scrap. But Admiral Gallery, who understood the power of symbols, fought to save it. He believed the U-boat was more than just a piece of enemy hardware. It was a testament to the bravery of his men and a physical reminder of a crucial moment in history. Through his efforts, a fundraising campaign was launched, and American schoolchildren donated nickels and dimes to bring the submarine to Chicago. It was painstakingly towed through the street, Lawrence Seaway, down through the Great Lakes, a ghost of the Atlantic, finding a final peaceful harbor in the American heartland. Today, the U-505 sits in a quiet, climate-controlled hall at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It is a national historic landmark, a silent giant resting far from the ocean. Visitors walk through her narrow, claustrophobic halls, running their hands along the cold steel walls. They see the cramped bunks where the crewmen slept, the complex web of pipes and dials in the control room, and the torpedo tubes that once carried death. They read the names of the men who served aboard her, German names, in a place of American history. And in the quiet of the exhibit, surrounded by the machinery of war, there is one display that always makes people pause. It is a small glass case, and inside, resting on a piece of simple cloth, is not a weapon, not a medal, but an old, worn bar of soap. It is the kind of soap that was issued to American sailors, a simple, unremarkable object that became the symbol of a remarkable choice. In the quiet of the museum, someone always asks the same question, their voice filled with a kind of gentle wonder. Why? Why would the Americans treat them like that, with such dignity, when they had every reason not to? Because war tests not just how you kill, but how you stop killing. And sometimes, honor wears clean hands.